Today I'm going to go over step by step how I made this wooden 6-pack bottle carrier. It's got some compartments for the bottles and a bottle opener on the side. So if you follow along these steps, you can kind of adapt them to whatever tools you have and hopefully end up with something that is just like this. So the first step in this is to cut out all of the pieces. You can see the main body of the carrier here. This is just 1x6 pine that I picked up. I got a 6-foot piece. Don't need that much, but that way I could cut out the pieces that I wanted and make them as free of knots as possible. So cut those out on the miter saw. This is 12 1/4 tall. This piece is 8 1/2 long, so the whole thing is about 10 inches by 12 1/4. Cut all those to length. Then I cut these angles on the pieces, again just with the miter saw. It's 1 3/4 this way and 4 1/2 inches down this way, so I connected that, cut off all those angles, drilled a 1-inch hole with a spade bit. Obviously it'd be better to use a Forstner bit and a drill press, but I don't have either of those, so I just did it by hand with the drill and a spade bit. The 1-inch dowel fits pretty tightly in those holes. Again, cut that to length. So that's the main part of it. You also need to cut out some plywood pieces. 1/4-inch plywood, which again I cut out with a miter saw and a hand saw for some of the longer portions because I don't have a table saw. So these pieces are the same width as the pine, about 5 1/2 inches, but I just used the pine to mark it so it would be exactly the right width. These pieces will go in like this to separate the compartments. They're 4 1/4 inches tall. I want the finished look to be 4 inches tall, so I made them a little extras because I'm going to route 1/4 inch deep grooves in these boards, so they'll actually sit down in those grooves. Another 1/4 inch piece, this one's actually going this way inside. Again, it's a little long, won't fit in there right now, because in the next step I'm going to route 1/4 inch deep grooves before I assemble it, and then insert this in so it's actually trapped in the wood. It doesn't need to be glued as well. So that's the cutout of all the pieces. Next step we'll be using the router table to route some grooves in these pieces so they interlock, and then in this piece so that they all fit together in there. Okay, I've started doing some of the router operations. So I set the fence so that half of the width of the pine boards is on either side of the bit, and the bit is a special bit for 1/4 inch plywood. It's a little bit smaller, a little bit undersized than 1/4 inch. So the bottom piece gets at least the way I'm doing it, a groove all the way through. Again, that's centered left and right, so let's just run through the router table. The end pieces get a stopped groove, so I measured 3 3/4 inch and made that mark on my fence so that when I push the piece through this way, I stop at that mark, and that leaves me with a stopped groove here because you don't want that extending up past where your plywood is going to be. So this is the way it's going to actually sit together. So you can see that that plywood is the long piece that's going to go in the center here actually just sits in those grooves. You can see what happened is that groove actually will show through the bottom. So if I had thought about it and did it again, I would stop that groove on both sides so you couldn't see it coming out the end. But we'll just call that a drainage hole in case things get spilled inside the carrier. So that's the first part of the router operations. With the same fence and bit setup, you can make the grooves in the shorter pieces. So I've done one here, again stopping it. This is stopped at 2 1/8 inches. So done one, I'll do the other, and then we have to change the fence setup to do the rest of the grooves. So I moved the fence back slightly and routed each of these grooves. I just did one, spun the piece around, and did the other so they'd be equal on both sides. What I pretty much did is divide this length into thirds as best I can. With the length, this is 8 1/2 inches, ended up being 2 2/3 inches. So I just got it as best I can, but now you can kind of see where the bottles will sit. Okay, move the fence back again just a little bit because this piece is wider, so I needed a thicker piece here and here. But again, this is routed to a little bit deeper, 2 3/8 of an inch. But you can see it'll fit together like this, and it'll fit all in those grooves that we already cut in this bottom piece, and almost ready for a dry fit. The next part is just to knock off the corner of this so it will actually fit in the stopped dado of this piece. So the last step before being able to do a dry fit is to knock off the corners of each of these. That hides the end of the dado in the side piece. I had to do a little bit of fine tuning. I just used a chisel to knock that corner off. Maybe slice a little bit more off of this side if it's a little bit too long. But what you want to do as you get to this step is check it with a square, clamp it up, and check it to make sure that the side isn't getting pushed one way or another by this piece of plywood. But then that's the last cutting step. So this is a pretty much complete dry fit before I start taking everything apart for sanding, staining, before I actually put it all together. So you can see it's clamped up. I cut some 1-inch strips and some 2-inch strips, and these will go on the other side, but you can see how this one will sit flush with the bottom. There'll be a little opening here so you can see the labels. Then the 1-inch strip will sit flush with the top of the interior dividers. So next I'll take it all down, I'll sand each piece, and then start thinking about some stain. So here's how things sit right now. I've started to glue it up. I've glued one side to the base. Now the next step, I'm going to try to glue the rest of these pieces together all at once, just to make sure everything fits up before the glue dries. So here it is, glued up, at least the parts that I did. Put some clamps on the bottom. Didn't put any clamps on the top part here because I think it'll just hold in place just fine. So after this, just need to do a little bit more sanding. Here it is, all glued up. I glued the bottom side strips on and then the top ones. So you can see those are on there. The dividers I didn't glue in mine because they're kind of locked in place by all the grooves that I cut in the pieces. But if you don't cut any grooves, don't use a router, you will need to actually glue those dividers in. Probably just glue them to the bottom piece. So the next step then is to sand it completely, which I already did. I used 100 grit and then 220 grit sandpaper to sand everything smooth. Got all the dust off, and now I'll be starting to stain it. So this is it after one coat of stain, and actually what I'm using is this right here, Polyshades combination stain and polyurethane. So I put one coat of that on. I think it turned out pretty well. It's kind of difficult to get those inside areas cleanly, but overall looks pretty good. I'm going to do another coat of this, and then I left the bottom, so I'll do that afterwards. So I have something to set it on. The directions say to hit this with 3/0 steel wool. I'm just going to use some 220 grit sandpaper, I think, just to smooth it up a little bit, and then go ahead and put the second coat on. Here it is with 2 coats of the stain and polyurethane. Put the second coat on here, and then I flipped it upside down and did 2 coats on the bottom as well, so I did that in 2 stages. I also added these screws on each side. I think it gives it kind of a cool look. If I were to do it again, I would drill those holes before staining, because now I have a little bit of touch-up I have to do. They're not strictly necessary, but I think it gives it kind of a cool look. The next step is to add on this bottle opener. Just got it off Amazon. Comes with screws. I think it was $7 or $8 or something like that. So I'm going to put this on, and that'll be the finishing touch. So here it is with that bottle opener all installed and everything. Hopefully you learned a little bit, and you'll be able to do something very similar to this on your own. Thanks for watching.